France. So basically, I spend my time looking at lots of strange bodies, trying to understand the strange ways in which people in the 16th century understood these bodies and how they wrote about them in both medical tracts, but also in literary texts. So my work kind of crosses across all sorts of different boundaries between history and literature and medicine. So to introduce kind of which surgeon in particular we'll be talking about today, I thought we could play a small game of Guess the Surgical Instrument. So all of the images that you're about to see are taken from the medical texts written by our mystery surgeon. And using Slido now, I'd like you to vote on our multiple choice questions for what you think is the most likely use of the instrument. So this is the first one. What do you think this instrument was used for? Do you think it was used for extracting blood, for suturing, or as a kind of mold to separate out the fingers when you need to do some closer surgery on the fingers? So I'll give you a few seconds to vote while Richard takes us over to Slido. Great, so 54% of you have said suturing, and that is the correct answer. So if Richard takes us back to the PowerPoint presentation now, we can see where this the little image that I sent you comes from. And this is indeed a kind of needle and thread and a little cloth mold or cloth kind of tracing paper bit in order to suture the skin back together again. And the image on the next slide shows that this was often a technique used on the face when the suturing had to be really precise and leave as kind of little a scar as possible. Okay, so if we now go to the next image, what was this instrument used for? If any of you have got a particularly good level of French, there is a slight clue in the French underneath. So it's open to voting now on Slido. Do you think this is used to fix a dislocated arm as some sort of splint, or perhaps to improve posture? So I'll give you a few seconds to vote on this now.
Just going to leave that image up a little bit longer and also tempt you into not seeing what other people are voting for.
Great idea, Richard. Oh, we're a bit more divided in our opinion on this one, based on the Slido vote so far. So actually, the correct answer for this one is to fix a dislocated arm. So the one that the least amount of you thought might be the correct one. When we go back to the presentation in the next image, we can see that this was quite a painful looking way of getting your joints back into place once they might have been dislocated. And yeah, difficult work. You're going to see in a second that the picture shows that you need perhaps up to 3 surgeons or 3 physicians helping out to try and clinch something back into place. Here you go. So it's kind of added onto the shoulder and twisted round to get the bones back in place. It looks pretty gruesome. I'm very glad that we're a bit more advanced than that now in our medical practice. And then finally, the third image. What do you think that these might have been used for? So we can see that they look a little bit like scissors. Do we think they might have been used to pull out teeth, to cut up bandages, or to remove bullets from the wounds in the body? What do you reckon? So a nice little extra bit about this image is that they're called a bec de crâne in French, which means like a crane's beak or a bird's beak, because they thought that the kind of scissoring shape resembled the shape of an animal beak. So I'll give you a few seconds to vote on this now on the Slido. We've got some stronger opinions this time on what people think that these kind of pliers might have been used for. So well done, everyone. It is indeed 73% of you are right. It is indeed to remove bullets from their wounds. So when we go back to the presentation, we can see a really unusual photo which shows an imaginary leg with all sorts of different wounds and all sorts of different tools being used to take out of the wounds. This is a really important instrument because this time and period in the Renaissance saw the invention of gunpowder, which meant that suddenly the battlefield was a much more dangerous place to be, and that surgeons and doctors had to respond to all sorts of kind of new injuries that were taking place. So I'll just request control now and share my screen. Or actually, it's actually stayed there, the PowerPoint. Richard, has it stayed on for you as well?
Should still be there.
Yeah.
But perhaps, Richard, perhaps you can just control it for me if I keep indicating to you when to go on to the next slide.
No problem, Rachel.
Fantastic. Okay, so onto the next slide then. We can see that all of these instruments were the ones used by our mystery surgeon, Ambroise Paré. And in fact, all of the illustrations are taken from a book that he published in 1575 called Les Oeuvres, or the Complete Works. So Ambroise Paré is known nowadays as the father of modern surgery in France. He lived between 1510 and 1590 and started off his career as a lowly barber surgeon. Unusual as that may sound for us today, training with a barber was the most common career route into surgery in the Renaissance period. Medicine was taught in Latin in universities, whereas surgery was deemed as not really very prestigious. It was too hands-on, too practical, and surely you didn't really need a kind of proper university education in order to be good at that. Paré is a significant figure for us because he went a long way to changing this really deep-seated perception of surgery by the innovative work that he did on the battlefield, gaining him so much respect that he eventually became the personal royal surgeon for Henri II and 3 other kings, and published this kind of game-changing treatise about surgery in 1575. So before we have a little closer look at Paré's work in more detail, I think we should go a bit deeper in contextualizing the culture of Renaissance medicine in which we worked. So on the next slide, I thought what we could do is a little word cloud of what you think of when you hear the word Renaissance. So I've added a few pictures on the screen here that might jog some thoughts, or you might even be familiar with some of the pictures from perhaps your English or your history classes at school. And now you can use Slido to kind of enter the first words that come into your head when you think of Renaissance. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Oh, this is a really great start. Rebirth is coming up most prominently at the minute. And if you look at the word Renaissance, that's actually a French word, a direct translation for rebirth, as naissance is birth. So Renaissance translates as directly as rebirth. Wow, this is a great collection. I'll just give it a couple more seconds. Right, excellent. So I think you've all shown a really clear understanding of what the Renaissance is. That idea of rebirth really is the kind of most important and exciting thing about the Renaissance. This was a period of kind of real discovery that was sparked off by the unearthing of old texts from ancient civilizations. So that's ancient Greece and ancient Rome. These include kind of the big guns of philosophy that you might already know, such as Plato or Aristotle. So these texts had been largely unread in the period just before, which we call the Middle Ages, but actually a lot of people in the Renaissance called the Dark Ages, because they felt that this was a time where people almost kind of regressed from the heights of the classical era and didn't really engage with these big kind of cultural ideas and questions that the ancient Greeks and Romans were really interested in. So the Renaissance then was a movement to bring back these ideas to the forefront. You might have heard the term Renaissance man before, there was this idea that someone learned should be adept at literature, at languages, at medicine, at philosophy, and natural philosophy, which is what we kind of nowadays might call science. And that all of this learning taught them how to live in the present in a more fulfilling way. Now, this big upheaval of ideas had some really dramatic consequences across European society. It led to the Reformation, which was the splitting of the Catholic and the Protestant church, as people kind of really grappled with how to read the Bible, how to interpret this text. It also led to the discovery of the New World, which is the kind of trips over to the Americas and elsewhere to kind of discover, I say in inverted commas, these kind of new different civilizations. And there was this kind of big period of reflection about how European society compared to the other civilizations that we found. You can see this picture of the globe that I put on the screen here is just part of this kind of big movement of how kind of remapping the world and remapping Europe's place in the world. There were big changes in art and culture. I think that's something that came out really nicely in the word cloud, was that this was a real period of kind of creativity and innovation. You can see at the top, we've got Shakespeare, who was a playwright kind of writing just after the people I'm interested in Renaissance France. But where he used his plays to stage all sorts of these kind of big questions about the human condition, about how people relate to each other, about politics, about religion. Also, we've got in the top right-hand corner the paintings of the Mona Lisa and the paintings by Leonardo da Vinci. There was this really exciting period where artists were trying to rethink the way in which art was produced, trying to move away from a kind of more 2D or flat way of painting in the Middle Ages and bring out this kind of more realistic 3D painting. And yeah, it was this kind of this real boom for cultural invention, and cultural artists and painters became really at the forefront and kind of leaders of society. And I've also included in the middle there just a picture of Florence, which is to indicate that actually the Renaissance started a little bit earlier in Italy than everywhere else. Around the 15th century in Italy, people were starting to be excited about these new ideas, and then there was a bit of a ripple effect outside of the rest of Europe. There were also then some big changes in medicine and how the body was understood. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the kind of two big classical figures of medicine that started to be re-engaged with and rethought about during the Renaissance in Europe. So at the top there, we've got Hippocrates. You may have heard him referred to before as kind of the father of medicine. And he's famous because he didn't pray to the gods to help when someone was ill like his contemporaries did, but rather believed in a careful observation of the body, and that to treat people effectively, we must first try to understand how the body works. He put forward a theory of the four humours that all needed to be balanced in the body to maintain health. So they are blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Doesn't sound very nice at all. This is where you might have kind of heard before about the idea of bloodletting as a treatment, or purging as a treatment, and that's exactly where this comes from. That the body was kind of made up of these different liquids, and if you were ill, it might mean that you had an imbalance, and so you needed to kind of rebalance it out by letting some liquid or other out. So some ideas from Hippocrates have kind of stood the test of time. And in fact, medical students today, when they start off their practice, have to swear the Hippocratic Oath, where they kind of swear that they will not do any intentional harm. And also, I mean, the idea of the four humours lasted for a really long time. It was completely kind of prominent during the medieval period, and even during the beginning of the Renaissance period, there was a real belief that that was what was going on inside the body. But I mean, nowadays, our understanding is completely different from that. And then the second doctor or physician who had a real impact in the Renaissance period was Galen, who lived in ancient Rome. Galen is kind of accredited with leading to major breakthroughs in anatomy and a greater understanding of the inner workings of the body. And part of the reason he was able to achieve this is that he dissected lots of animals in order to gain a better understanding of how the body works, and especially how these different humours works. And one of his kind of major discoveries was that he discovered that arteries carry blood around the body. So these were two kind of big guys in classical medicine. In the Middle Ages, when they weren't engaging so much with these ideas, medicine kind of didn't really get much better in our modern eyes. The church had a really tight grip over medical ideas and preached that sickness was a divine punishment for sin. And you might have already learnt about in school the Black Death in 1348 that actually wiped out 40% of Britain's population. Kind of spread really rapidly with this unknown cause, and people kind of panicked and totally resorted to these different kind of superstitious cures, or just resorted to prayer and homemade remedies. In the next slide, however, we can see that in the 16th century, things started to change. And along with this kind of rebirth of learning and creativity, there was a rebirth of kind of medical understanding. The power of the church started to wane a little bit, which opened up the space for a kind of whole range of people and different practices that made medicine this kind of really exciting melting pot of different ideas, different experiences and different types of knowledge, which we'll get to a little bit later on with our looking at the immerse paré more closely. So we have the physicians on one hand who learnt most of their practice during their time at university. I mentioned before that this was in Latin. This was because universities were very much for the elite of society, the kind of most intelligent and the most respected layer. And these physicians would become kind of experts in Hippocrates and Galen and would read these texts in the original Latin and Greek, and in fact most often be taught in Latin as well. But however much these physicians kind of relied on and really loved the work of Hippocrates and Galen, they also started to experiment with some new practices. And the biggest one probably was dissection and anatomy. Where they started to dissect not only animals like Galen had done, but also to dissect people. And this was a bit of a kind of shadowy and dangerous trade, because as it was just starting, often what would happen is universities might be gifted criminals who'd go straight from the kind of hanging block into the anatomy theatre. Or there's loads of kind of gruesome and really fun stories about physicians and their students going into graveyards and digging freshly buried corpses up so that they could kind of have a peek at them and work out what exactly happened to them or why they might have died. As the 16th century grew, this practice of dissection became kind of slowly more popular and more accepted, and led to a real shaking up and a challenging of the ancient ideas. We have probably the most famous physician of the 16th century is Vesalius, who decided that when he was doing anatomy, it was more important to really look at what you were doing in front of you rather than just to accept all these ideas from Galen and Hippocrates, because often what ended up is these really bizarre moments of dissonance where people would open up the body and see that there aren't these humours kind of rolling around, as Galen and Hippocrates thought, but would kind of immediately say, oh no, I must be wrong, because they had so much respect and Galen and Hippocrates had so much authority that they really followed their lead. But this kind of, started to change as the practice of anatomy and dissection became more and more respected. So beyond physicians, then we have surgeons, like our immerse paré, who we're going to turn to in a minute, who, as I said before, faced with the battlefield, suddenly had these new wounds to treat and suddenly had to develop different tools and different ways of responding to these new injuries. This practice of working on the battlefield did a long way of increasing the respectability of surgeons, and over the 16th century they kind of slowly started to build into guilds and into these kind of becoming more of a professional rather than these kind of barbers who did a little bit of surgery on the side. Beyond surgeons, then, we have midwives, who are also, like surgeons, suffered from the fact that they were not very well respected in society. There was an idea that midwives were not properly trained, and so they can't possibly understand the body properly. However, what we see with midwives, especially in France, is loads of really exciting texts where midwives write down their own stories. We find that midwives drew on a huge wealth of personal experience and kind of homegrown knowledge. And what we find is they're women who've been delivering babies hundreds of times and could really draw on that kind of practical first-hand experience as they were working. And then kind of even more on the periphery of the kind of accepted medicine, we have charlatans and wise women who kind of exploited some of those lingering benefits from the Middle Ages, exploited the kind of folk medicine that was going on as kind of everyday practices, and would sell all sorts of kind of dubious drugs or dubious cures in the hope of gaining themselves a little bit of extra money. So as we can see, it was this kind of really jostling marketplace of all sorts of different ideas, all sorts of different people, different practices, who were all kind of competing in a way in order to say that they understood the body best. And just to finish off, what I have here is the invention of the printing press on the screen. This was a really big deal in medicine because it allowed the spread of ideas to happen much more easily and much more kind of further afield than it had done before. So we're in this kind of time where a lot of ideas were changing in Europe, and these ideas were spreading around as society was becoming more literate and sharing ideas between different groups and different countries. Great, so on the next slide, we have if Richard could send it over, yeah, we have a little passage that Ambroise Paré wrote. So Ambroise Paré is credited with the innovative practice that he did on the battlefield, and what this passage shows here is perhaps the most kind of famous and most experimental thing that he did. So I'm going to read out the passage, and then what I wanted to do is just reflect a little bit on some of the questions that the passage brings up, and then we can do answer some of these questions in the word cloud. So what I want you to be thinking about as we're reading is what sort of knowledge is on display here? What is the way in which Ambroise Paré is learning about the body, and how is that affecting the actions that he takes? So Ambroise Paré wrote, "Now, at that time, I was very inexperienced because I had not yet seen the treatment of wounds made by the arquebuse." So that's a kind of new type of gun that was just starting to be used in the early 16th century. "It is true that I had read in the first book of Jean de Vigo," so he's a kind of contemporary writer who Ambroise Paré would have known and would have worked with, "about wounds in general, chapter 8, that wounds made by firearms are poisoned because of the powder, and for their cure he commands that they be cauterized with oil." So that means you pour burning oil onto the skin. "Cauterized with oil of elderberry, to which a little treacle should be added. Not to fail in the use of this burning oil, and knowing that such treatment could be extremely painful for the wounded, I wanted to know before I used it how the other surgeons carried out the first dressing. This they did by applying the said oil as nearly boiling as possible to the wounds, using tents and setons, so I plucked up courage to do likewise. At last I ran out of oil and was constrained to apply a digestive made of egg yolk, oil of roses and turpentine. That night I could not sleep easily, thinking that by the default in cautery I would find the wounded to whom I had failed to apply the said oil dead of poisoning, and this made me get up at first light to visit them. Beyond my hopes, I found those on whom I had put the digestive dressing feeling little pain from their wounds, which were not swollen or inflamed, and having spent quite a restful night. But the others, to whom the said oil had been applied, I found fevered, with great pain and swelling around their wounds. From then I resolved never again so cruelly to burn poor men wounded with arquebus shot." Great. So what I want us to think about with this question is first of all, what are the different sorts of learning in this passage? So you can now on Slido enter your words, which will look up into a word cloud, and I'll give you a few minutes just to reflect on the passage and think about what are the different types of learning that Ambroise Paré undergoes while he's on the battlefield. So we've got lots of great responses coming through already. I'm going to give you a little bit longer. Great, well, some really great responses coming through. Great. So what all of you have really focused on here is this idea of trial and error. I love that that's the biggest one, because yeah, exactly. I think the big message, the big take-home message of this passage is that he runs out of the materials that he normally uses, and so it's almost a kind of happy accident that he then has to use trial and error and has to experiment a little with something he hopes might work but isn't sure that might work, and actually it's that which really works on the patient. So I think this passage is really interesting because before we get to this point, there's he kind of works through the different ways. So I think some of you have written observation, which is exactly right. The second moment in the passage is when he's observing the surgery, observing the work of his different surgeons and hoping that he can learn through them how he might do it. And even before then, he's talking about reading in the book of his fellow surgeon Jean de Vigo. So what we get is a kind of narrative of different methods of learning. We have, okay, he reads in the book what he thinks he should do. He watches the other surgeons to see what they do and if that works. And then when he has to be innovative, it's a great word that someone's used there, and when he kind of has to be practical and has to be experimental, then that's when he introduces his own version of the cure, and is able to kind of very happily realise that what he's doing is right. And I think the last line that we just saw is really important, because from that moment on, he decides, okay, I'm not going to treat the patients with the burning hot oil as I was doing before. Instead, I'm going to use my new method. So what's that showing is that he's really learning from this experience, and he's according kind of a lot of value to the idea of this first-hand knowledge, the self-learning and the trial and error that he's gone through. Excellent. Okay, so the second question that I wanted us to have a think about is about the language that Paré uses. So he writes his texts in everyday French, which, as we saw before, that actually a lot of it, the university learning, was done in Latin, and there was a big emphasis on reading texts in Latin. So why do we think that Paré might write in the kind of everyday French rather than writing in Latin? So you should be able to now on Slido put your ideas into the word cloud there.
Let me catch up with you in a moment. I'm just accessing the poll.
Right, I've sent the poll live now.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks very much.
And thanks for your questions, by the way. I know there are some questions coming through related to Rachel's talk, which I'm sure she'll address in a sec. I just wanted to say also feel free, if you have general questions, to stick those in the Q&A as well, and we'll get onto those after Rachel's talk is finished. Sorry, Rachel, back to you.
Thank you. Okay, great. So perhaps if Richard could send us back to the word cloud now, we can have a look at some of your thoughts. Great. So the big word that's kind of leaping out at me right now is access, making this knowledge accessible to more people in a way that more people can understand. And that's exactly right. So Paré felt that just like he had learned through kind of experience and learning from others, rather than learning in the books and learning through texts, that actually it was more important that everyday people could learn in that different way. So there was a sense that surgeons who'd been really dismissed as not really needing to understand the body properly in order to work. Barré showed that, no, hang on a minute, it is important that surgeons know what they're doing and can understand the body and how the body might react to certain things. And so he thought that with his work, he could try and educate his old peers. He could educate the everyday people who were trying to learn how to become surgeons by writing in French in a way that they could understand, and reaching a kind of much wider audience. I really also like that some of the other answers that we've got in here are talking about a personal account and a place where he can write down his personal thoughts. And I think that's something that's really important with Barré, is that exactly that part of his work was part of this kind of new valorization of personal experience and this hands-on practical knowledge. And that, writing in French rather than in Latin, which is kind of the language of literature and high culture, was just another way of showing that he was doing medicine in a bit of a different way and trying to get some different ideas across. Great, thank you very much, everyone. That's me finished for today, but I'm really excited now to see some of the questions in the chat. And can answer questions about medicine and the study of the history of medicine, but also can answer your kind of questions a bit more broadly about what it's like to learn at university.
Great. I'll start with a couple that came through a while ago, Rachel. I think relating to the Renaissance slide in particular. We'll start with something that's probably more specific.
Great.
Do you think these medical advances owed anything to the decline of the church that you mentioned?
Yes. Yeah. So I think that's quite a contested question in kind of Renaissance scholarship. I think what that reflects is that the decline of the church meant that the church was loosening its grip a little bit. So in particular, the church had a pretty big grip on dissection. They didn't like that dissection was happening as a practice. And there was a kind of really strong belief that our bodies worked in the way it did because God had given a kind of certain function and a certain use to each individual organ. And the church were really worried about dissection and this kind of practical hands-on knowledge kind of showing up this belief or showing that it might be wrong. So I think something that's important to know about the Renaissance is that all these different kind of strands of culture and learning were often connected. And that's a really good example where the decline of the church meant that this kind of medical and scientific knowledge could kind of boom in a slightly different way.
It must have been a really exciting period in which to have lived, and you've really kind of really brought that home today, I think. It's a slightly different tack now. How far were these medical advances available to normal people in this period? Was it mainly only rich people who benefited from them? Great question.
Excellent question. And the person asking it is absolutely right. That very much so in this kind of beginning period, it was the rich people who could afford good medical treatment, or it was the people who were living at court, so the people living around the king, that had access to the most kind of cutting edge work in medicine. But something important to kind of bring up here is that although there were lots of problems of kind of folk medicine and traditional medicine and lots of bizarre cures and bizarre ways of thinking about the body, actually, like we were saying about the midwife, lots of these practices were what people had been doing for hundreds of years and had just passed down through generations. And a lot of times they were things that did work, that actually there was some kind of truth in it. And I think we have that a little bit today. If we think about those kind of things that our grannies say to us or our mums say to us, these kind of homegrown cures, if you like, actually often there's a bit of truth in them because they have worked over years and years of experience and they have been passed down.
It's kind of folklore, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So although everyday people didn't have access to the most cutting edge cures, actually they often were able to look after themselves quite well.
And I think as much a comment as opposed to a question, but one that slightly hints in a reverse direction about Paré. It says Paré as a surgeon was considered to be not a high class job, as mentioned before. So from relatively sort of lowly origins, to use an expression from the time, perhaps, he may not have been taught to write in Latin. Would that be?
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. Yeah, if he didn't have the education, I don't think he was kind of versed in Latin or taught how to read in Latin. So French was kind of the natural way for him to communicate and communicate his ideas. Yeah, that's a great comment. Something I should have mentioned.
And then another one on Paré specifically is really interesting. Do you think Paré had a very high IQ? He was very intelligent for the time, but how do you think he'd fare with today's academic understanding of medicine?
That is a really excellent question, and I love trying to think of the links between our time and the Renaissance period. I think Paré is a really interesting figure because what he was doing in that passage there was that really kind of innovative thinking. He was instinctively thinking, oh, this isn't working, I'm going to try this and see if that works. And that's actually really quite a kind of modern scientific approach. And that's what really set him apart from some of his contemporaries, is that I think he had those kind of early scientific instincts in him. So I think in some ways, maybe if he'd been living now and had the benefit of all of that, all of the knowledge that we know now about the body, I think that level of instinct and that level of kind of, experimental knowledge that he had, I think that probably meant that he still would today be thinking kind of creatively and interestingly about what he was thinking. So maybe he'd be helping us to make advances now in modern medicine.
Great question that was, and also again on Paré, but this more sort of his influence over time. From that passage, could it suggest that this sort of thinking, could it suggest that this is where the ethical pillar of non-maleficence, I can never say that, non-maleficence comes from? Sorry, terrible pronunciation. Would you like to define that, or shall I, even though I can't pronounce it?
So I think, I actually don't know exactly what it means, but it's meaning about kind of treating the patient in the right way, right?
Yeah, my understanding is that it's not intentionally doing any harm to anybody.
It's the do no harm versus the heal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's the other half.
So I think the question of kind of medical ethics is a really interesting one, because as we saw, that Hippocratic oath that medical students take today, some of those ideas were really being talked about and discussed in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So I think that something that's interesting for me definitely about medicine is that it is this kind of practical discipline. How do you treat the body? How do you treat the body as a kind of medical object? But then there's also alongside that the questions of, hang on a minute, this is also a subject. It's a person who can think and who can feel and who can have pain, and we need to be taking into account both of those things. I think that Paré's passage shows really well that he's learning from the patient and how the patient is responding, and that is a kind of fundamentally ethical response, is that he's really taking into account the experience of the patient in this kind of medical encounter that they're having together. And it's kind of paving the way for a kind of more compassionate surgery, certainly, and a kind of more compassionate medicine.
As with last week, there's some amazing questions coming through. I think we're going to have to say we're going to be timed out, but what I'm going to do, Rachel, is I'm going to do a relatively quick fire one to you, and then there's 3 that have come in which are sort of touching on larger themes.
Great.
So quick fire one, any book suggestions which spring to mind which are about medicine and history?
Yes, so Roy Porter is the kind of big guns for thinking about British medical history, and his writing is really accessible and really, it's a good kind of entry point in. So I'd absolutely recommend him. Otherwise, there's been lots of kind of interesting books about medical imagery and the images of medicine out recently. So I got given for Christmas a book called The Sick Rose. I can't remember who the author is now, but it's kind of a history of medical illustration. And that's another really great way of kind of getting into the history of medicine and having that kind of really clear visual line that we can see through the different changes.
Brilliant. 3 more, with apologies to those that I'm going to have to exclude. The first one's a bit sort of summative, I guess, rather than substantive. How much has Renaissance medicine been a part or an origin of modern medicine?
Yeah, so I love that question. And I think a lot of what I do in my research is to say that we can really trace some ideas in modern medicine back to the Renaissance, because what the Renaissance was doing was really trying to change how people had understood medicine. So, of course, there's kind of lots of really big steps that happen from the Renaissance understanding, which is still quite obsessed with the humours and is still understanding the body in a different way. But I think what the Renaissance was doing was starting to build starting to allow people to kind of build the right skills and the right thinking tool set, the right critical analysis in order to reach those discoveries that we got later on.
There are two fantastic questions about men and women and differences. I'm going to pick one of them. How do you think medicine would have advanced differently in the absence of misogyny? If women had been taken seriously, do you think things would have been different?
That is an excellent question. And I think actually it's still a relevant question today, because still medical decisions are made more often, or medical research happens more often around men's bodies than it does women's bodies. So yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think so. Some of what my research is about is that, say, the knowledge of the midwives was really kind of really looked down upon, and actually there was some kind of nuggets of gold in how the midwives understood the body and understood medicine. So I think that if women had been listening to, we would have had a kind of much more holistic approach to medicine, and an approach which took into account different factors and different types of experience and different types of knowledge.
And it was amazing having been in a session the other day about gender inequality at universities with Professor Sarah Gilbert, the lead on the Oxford vaccine, asking similar questions today. Here's somebody who's pretty prominent, it would be fair to say, especially over the last year. Sometimes these questions persist, and brilliant questions that one was too. Yeah. And I'm going to conclude with one which I think is fairly broad. Yeah. Do you think the scientific innovation and medical developments were also down to necessity rather than natural curiosity or competitive reasons?
That's a great question. And I think actually in the Paré quote, the passage that we looked at, all of those things are kind of there in a way. There is his kind of natural curiosity, but that is coming out of necessity. He's got the men in front of him who are dying on the battlefield, and he needs to do something to treat them. So I think probably it's a mixture of all of those different things, which are what eventually kind of pushes forward knowledge. And I mean, even today, you can see with the vaccine, this is like a really exciting scientific and medical development, which is coming out of some innovative ideas about how to do medicine, but they are really pushed forward by necessity, and they're happening because they're really needed.
Brilliant. Rachel, we've got 2 or 3 other questions that we're not going to have time for to answer publicly. If there's a possibility that you may be able to scribble a text down, because you're also in on that slider, but we've been sharing the questions for you to enable you to do the wonderful presenting that you've done today. We can't thank you enough. In terms of the participants here, thank you so much for attending. And what we're going to do is in the next few minutes, we're going to send you a follow-up email. Firstly, it has a PDF of the whole presentation, sort of both parts of it. Secondly, would really appreciate your help with this. A very brief evaluation feedback. You can do it in probably about 90 seconds, if that. And we really learn from these things. Each talk will sort of actually learn from the previous one in that respect and what you can provide. And also over the course of the next 24 hours, the academic part of this presentation, as so wonderfully done by Rachel, will be available to those who've registered, because as Chris said earlier, we've recorded it. So thanks very much again. Good best wishes to all students. Rachel, would you like to say cheerio?
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and good luck for you all. That from the questions that you're asking, you're clearly like a really curious bunch, and I think you're all going to do really well, whatever university you end up at or whatever subject you end up choosing.
Chris?